Hi there, back to J300 with a lecture today about using Gestalt and specifically using Gestalt to design a resume. And it's always good when you start out a lecture and you don't have any idea of what we're talking about. That means you're going to learn something. So Gestalt, hopefully that is a new word for you so that you walk away from this lecture with a new understanding about what Gestalt is and how you can use it for your resume. Before we dive in here, I will say that this is one of those lectures that I really hope that you apply to your work on your resume. There are lots and lots of practical tips that are here. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take this very large concept, which is this almost philosophical concept of how we see the world and how we group things together, and try to connect it to really specific things that you can do with your resume to make sure that they're effective. So some really practical tips in here that are linked to some bigger thinking. So let's dive in. The first thing that we need to do is give credit to the source of a lot of this. The text that I'm using here is called Perception and Imaging. If you're interested, a really kind of seminal book that talks about what we as modern people in the world do when we look at things. And if you're interested in just this idea of how people see things and understanding it better, then this book is excellent in terms of understanding that. So, Gestalt is this idea, this psychological idea of how do we group things in our minds. What do we do when we look at something? What sort of assumptions do we make? What sort of groupings do we make when we see things together? So Gestalt provides us with 4 different laws of grouping. And what you're going to notice is that a lot of these laws of grouping kind of hold hands with what Robin Williams, inside of the Non-Designer's Design book, what she says are, contrast, alignment, repetition, and proximity. A lot of the things that she's talking about are very similar to what we're talking about here when we talk about Gestalt. These are good bullet points to memorize here. If you can think to yourself at certain times when you're designing things, have I gone through kind of my Gestalt checklist in terms of, have I thought about proximity and similarity and continuity and closure? We're going to deal with each one of these individually, and we're going to talk about how each one of them can influence what you're going to do on your resume. So let's start with proximity. Proximity is probably one of the easiest ones of these to define, and that is just the closeness of objects. And it's probably important for us to write down in our notes the relative closeness of objects. If this thing and this thing are seemingly far apart, well, they're going to seem a lot closer together if there's something that's very distant from them. So proximity is almost always relative to whatever else is happening on the page or on the screen or on the business card or whatever you're designing. Proximity is a relative measure. Closer things are, the more that we are likely to associate them. So, this is a very obvious illustration of 4 dots that seem very strongly associated, whereas the one over on the far left, it doesn't seem very strongly associated at all, right? We take that 1 dot away, and this group seems much more strongly associated than it did when it had the seemingly random dot over there on the left-hand side. What happens when we go ahead and add more dots to this deal? Well, these 4 dots that seemed so closely associated with each other, especially relative to when we had 1 dot that was hanging out on its own. These 4 seemed so closely associated. Now when we add more dots, they actually don't seem very associated at all. It seems like they are much more associated with the vertical stripe of dots that's descending from each one of them, right? Same deal here. We go ahead and add many dots to each one of these squares, and we see that those dots are much more strongly associated with each other than these stripes of dots are, even though, again, the dot on the top left of this one right here and the bottom right of this one right here, they're the same distance as these two are, but we're much more likely to see these as being associated with one another because of the way that these are grouped. Same thing here, we can certainly see that those stripes horizontally are going to be strongly associated with one another, and the ones that are even closer, this dot right here is closer to this dot than this dot is to this dot over here, right? But we are much more likely to see them as being associated because of the relative proximity of all of those, right? If you look at this list of words, it's obviously fat, hat, jay, and her, red, hawk, right? But as we go ahead and get them closer to one another, we start to, with proximity, be more likely to group them together, right? So proximity can help us to group things in this particular way. I think it's really a curious thing that even this amount of distance can make us want to still separate those words, and we really need them to be tracked together in that very particular way that makes sure that they all have even spacing between them and that they all have similar proximity. That's the thing that makes us want to associate those things, right? So we certainly called this mergers in photography, right? When things are so close to one another that we're likely to group them together because they are visually confusing in this way. We certainly saw this in photography, so that things are so close together, they seem to run together, that we're willing to group them together as well. So let's look at this when we're talking about proximity of titles, right? So this right here is an example of a resume layout. It's not the way to do a resume, but it's simply one example that we'll be working with as our framework here, right? So we see the titles underneath my name here, and it says education, references, work experience, and skills. So look at the variations in these resumes here. If I lay it out this way, that's different from if I lay it out this way. Why is that, right? Why is it different from here to there, and which one do we prefer? Now, many of us have been taught that going ahead and centering that text over the top of that column, that's a strong way to create a subhead there. But I'm going to go ahead and dispute that, and I'm going to use the work experience one as an example. This work experience is now maybe 1 or 2 inches away from the thing that it is related to. We have weakened that proximity grouping that we once had. The same thing is true of skills down here. Skills is now far away from what it is actually modifying. Whereas in the beginning, skills was right on top of the thing that it was modifying. This, Gestalt would tell us, is a stronger way to link the subheadings with the things that they are modifying right beneath them. This is a weaker way to do that, right? This is a particularly terrible and weak way to do it, because now we have weakened that completely so that it is really, really far away from the thing that it is modifying. What about proximity of subsections, right? So the subsections underneath, how can we lay those out? So now we look at variations in the resume that look like this. Consider whether this is a stronger way of using Gestalt or whether this is a stronger way of using Gestalt. Now I'm just toggling back and forth so that you can see the difference here. The difference is that I'm providing just a little bit more internal margin. I'm using some of those words from our previous lecture, right? A little bit more of those internal margins, a slightly larger internal margin in between things, and by doing that I am strengthening the association that this has with itself, and I'm weakening the association that these two things have with one another. And that's probably good, right? This thing is more related to itself than it is related to that. So a little bit more internal margin in between those two things, that probably makes sense, right? All right, second kind of Gestalt grouping that we need to be aware of is the grouping of similarity. We are much more likely to group things as being similar when we see those things having or as being together when we see similarities between them. This happens in class all the time. If I were to look out onto a class of 100 people, and there are 10 people over on the left-hand side of class that are all wearing, let's say, the same sorority sweatshirt, I'm going to assume those are all students from the same sorority. If I see 10 people all walk in together, that's an example of proximity that we were talking about before, right? We're likely to see them as being similar. If I look out on the crowd of students and I see 10 students all wearing the same hat and they're sprinkled throughout the class, even though they don't have proximity, they do have similarity, and so I will probably see them as being linked as well. So similarity has to do with shape, it has to do with size, has to do with color, it has to do with movement. The same thing would be true if I looked out on a group of 100 students and I saw 9 kindergartners throughout the class, and I saw them all going completely bananas, right? That would be an example of the size of those being similar and movement of those things being similar, and so I'm going to go ahead and logically group them together, right? So this is an example of how that works, right? We can see that over on the left-hand side here, these are all similar in shape and they are similar in proximity. This dot right here is just as close to this square right here as it is to this circle right below it. But we are much less willing to group these two together than we are this entire line of things there. So similarity of shape, similarity of proximity, both working together here. We are willing to see this as being a line of pink dots, and we're not as likely to push across and group these things together as being a particular line as well. Size can do it. Over on the right hand side, if you look closely, you can see that I did like this little pink drop shadow on each of them. Texture can do it, depth can do it. All of those things can make us want to group things together, right? Inside of the text that this is based on, we see Zacchaeus, the author, he makes reference to this photo. This is a famous photo by a photojournalist named Bruce Davidson, who took this photo in Harlem in the 50s, I believe. And what Zacchaeus points out when he uses this is an example of using similarity. Basically, the photographer here, in this case Davidson, is making a reference to the Christ figure, right? Making the reference to the crucifix. We see someone standing very much in the same way as the crucifix. We see the horizontal stripe coming through the railing passing behind the figure here. We see the posture of the figure. We see so many similarities that it's hard for us not to make that visual leap and say, oh, it reminds me of that thing because it is so similar, right? How can we use this in our resume? Again, these are very abstract ideas, but how can we use this in our resume? Again, starting with the same basic resume in 2 columns here, we can look at variation A, and then we can look at variation B. And look how much more strongly we associate each one of those subheadings as being similar to one another when we just go ahead and add a little bit of color, right? A little bit of warm color, because as we learned in the color lecture, that will help them emerge and get the attention of the viewer, right? But also the kind of color that is going to make us see them as similar, right? We can also do something like this, right? We could go ahead and say that thing up at the top is important in the same way that these subheadings are important below it. You don't need to like this. I don't think I particularly do myself, but it's just an example of how we can go ahead and see things as being similar, right? Number 3, our third Gestalt method of grouping things is called continuity, right? And that is that we as human beings, again, we're getting inside of human psychology here, that we as human beings like to continue things. So if we're going to go ahead and start in one direction, we're very likely to continue with one direction, whether it be the band. Oh, bad joke, sorry. Whether it be a line of dots, whether it be any sort of form, we're likely to want to continue it with as few interruptions as possible, right? So what does that look like when we look at it with a line of dots? What two letters do you see here? It's very obvious. You see two X's. But why do you see two X's? I think the reason that we want to see two X's is because we want to continue this line until it ends, and we want to continue this line until it ends. And so we're likely to see this as two X's. That's a natural human reaction. But really, we could just as easily see this as being a W and as being an M. Why don't we see it as those? Because that would involve us starting down this direction and then veering that direction and then veering this direction before veering that direction. We are much more likely to want to see it as X's than to be able to make all of those turns that it takes to create a W or all of these turns that it takes to create an M. All right? We talked about this earlier when we were talking about typography. We talked about how the serifs at the bottom of each one of these letters, that they create continuity, right? That they will push us along the baseline so that we will continue seeing text and going that direction. We talked about how sans serifs don't have that continuity. They don't want to push us along the baseline in that way. Script does indeed have continuity in the fact that it pushes us all the way through and connects that word as one. We can find something that has even less continuity than even this sans serif up here, where this word is standing so upright and it has so little continuity along the baseline that it's not meant to be a continuous form. Again, this isn't right or wrong. It's not to say that the font at the bottom is the wrong way of doing typography, but what it is to say is it says that we should be aware of this when we're laying things out. So let's look at this when we're talking about issues of readability on your resume here. Same basic resume to start out with. How do we affect that resume? Well, if you look at the difference between A and B here, right? So if we look at this one as being the first one and this one as being the second one, do you see how this is very confusing for our reader? What the designer is intending is that our education should be read this way and then come up here to be read down that way. Well, I don't think that we're likely to do that. We're more likely to continue wanting to go down this way. Are we likely to see references start here and then go down and then somehow veer up into this area here? That's probably pretty unlikely. We do see this when we see resumes laid out, that people lay things out in kind of a zigzag swerving fashion, and we should be aware that that's the least likely way for people to want to group things in terms of continuity, right? Same thing is true here, right? If we lay things out in this way and the references are so crammed up against here, maybe not the best example. Closure here. Closure is a fun one because it is it's very likely to come up as something that you're tempted to do toward the end of your resume design. So closure is this idea that if we encase something in a package, if we outline it, if we border it, if we put a stroke around it, if we put a screen behind it, that we are going to be telling the reader all of these things belong together. And we certainly do this a ton when we are designing things, especially early in our design career, because it's the easiest way to group things together, right? If we want things to all be in the same group, we literally just close them in a particular way. So this one right here is obviously 3 dots. Ask yourself, what shape do these 3 dots create? Well, they obviously create a triangle, right? What about these 4 dots right here? What shape do they create? A slightly off square, correct? What sort of shapes does this create? It creates a circle, right? Well, the reality is that all of these dots that you were looking at, they were part of that original shape, right? And we are likely as readers to want to go ahead and close that shape in and connect these things together and say everything inside of here is part of that shape and that unit. Same thing here. We're likely to want to go ahead and draw these things and create closure. Why don't we create the triangle that we were willing to create before? Well, because we have more information and we're able to create even stronger closure. And when we as humans can create stronger closure, that's what we're going to do. We're going to group those things together even more strongly. There's a famous design logo out there that you guys have all seen, maybe as your Amazon purchases have been getting ordered to you in the last couple weeks here, and that's the FedEx logo. Some of you have never seen this little visual trick here, and some of you are shaking your head knowingly saying, I know this exactly, and that is this. Within the FedEx logo, there is a closure trick. There's a closure visual trick that's inside there. Look between the E and the X, and you see that there is an arrow. And the arrow is a great visual cue for what FedEx does. It moves things onward, right? It progresses things, right? And so we, as viewers, are willing to look at that E and that X and see that closure. Notice how much weaker the closure is if we move that E and the X far away from one another, right? The stronger that we close that in, the more easily we see that as being an arrow from left to right. So you're welcome. Every time you see a FedEx truck from now on, you will see that hidden little Easter egg of an arrow that slides right in there. So how do we use this on a resume? Same starting resume, same exact thing going on here. Oftentimes, when we're designing resumes, we are very tempted to do this. We'll put a screen behind something. I think that's a good technique. I think that can be used to go ahead and say education and references, those two things belong together, and we're going to hold them apart from work experience and skills. Maybe that's the way you decide to organize your resume, and you use that screen to create closure, right? Or maybe you go ahead and use this kind of a stroke that surrounds the entire thing. I would tell you, just as your little resume fashion consultant here, that generally strokes are seen as being old-fashioned. They're kind of a product of the 80s, and when we thought it was so incredible to be able to quickly, inside of computer programming, inside of desktop publishing, to be able to put a square around something so easily. So beware of that. That's generally an old-fashioned technique to use. But definitely stay away from this one. Definitely stay away from using both the screen and the stroke around the screen, because basically what you're doing is you're doing two things that have the same meaning, right? You're basically trying to overdo it here. The analogy that I use all the time is that I let my dog out in the backyard because we have a fence in the backyard, right? And that keeps her from leaving the yard. Well, that's what you've done when you've added a screen or when you've added a stroke around there. So why would you also need to put your dog on a leash when they have a fence around the yard? You don't need to do both. One of them will do. So in this case, I would recommend probably using the screen. And definitely don't do this god-awfulness, right? This is a mess, no scalloped edges or weird stuff. You don't need to decorate your resume. You should just be thinking about making it effective. 4 different ways that Gestalt can be useful to design your resume. I would love to see you applying a bunch of these ideas. Of course, not this idea of the scalloped resume, but I think that should cover it for today for the resume Gestalt lecture. I hope that was helpful, and I'll talk to you again soon.